Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, as you are probably aware, if you've been around the channel for very long, my kids and I just got back from Scotland last week. And one of the places that we had the privilege to visit while we were staying in Inverness was just outside of the town of Inverness, and it's the Culloden battlefield. Now, I know that most people who have heard of Culloden today, they know it because of the TV show Outlander, but it really is an incredibly significant event in the history of Western English-speaking peoples. And I mean the history of the British, but also the history of the United States. Someone like myself, whose ancestry goes through Eastern Kentucky, and before that, the American South. The American South was heavily populated by people who fled from Scotland and from the British Isles in the aftermath of what happened at Culloden, in the aftermath of things like the Highland clearances. So this is an incredibly significant event to a lot of people, whether they realize it or not. So we're going to take a look at our friends from Extra History today. They have a video about the Battle of Culloden, and we'll try to break it down. I do have a video coming from the battlefield at Culloden. I'm going to try to get that edited and up to you guys in the next couple of weeks. But in the meantime, link is in the description if you want to check it out without my commentary. There's a reason why Extra History is one of the channels I react to the most. I love the way they tell a story. I love their style of animation. And I think they do a great job of presenting something that we can use as our textbook to dive a little bit deeper into this topic. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one.
The Scottish Highlands, April 16th, 1746. Orders ring out in the boggy moorland. The red-coated infantrymen of the British Army's 4th Regiment fix bayonets, shivering with cold and fear as they wait for the enemy. But they don't have to wait long. It's hard to see through the cannon smoke and driving sleet, but they can hear the roar of thousands of voices coming closer. The Scottish rebels, the enemy. They burst from the misty cover, Highlanders, garbed in tartan, some wielding broadswords and shields, others with bayonets and muskets. They scream Gallic war cries as they rush toward the government troops.
All right, so let me pause real quick. I just want to break down a couple of things there. First of all, I don't think people realize just how far north Scotland is. If you look at the Scottish Highlands, now Inverness is often called the gateway to the Highlands. It's the largest city in the Highlands. The Highlands are kind of the northern and western part of Scotland. If you look at a map, there's this real easy to see divide that kind of runs between the Highlands and the Lowlands, and most of the population of Scotland today lives in the Lowlands, but it wasn't always that way. There used to be a lot more people in the Highlands, and that comes later with something called the Highland clearances, which we may or may not address in this video, but it's really far north. And so even in the summer, we were just there last week. It was June, late June, beginning of July. The temperature was in the 50s. And the wind was really strong. It was cold. It was cold. We left here in Northeast Ohio, where people don't realize Ohio is about even with Spain, which is like the Florida of Europe. So the weather can get interesting in Scotland. And there's this driving sleet in April as this is going down. I believe this is also Easter Monday, which means it's the day after Easter when this all goes down, and there's some religious significance to all of that. But he also makes a reference there to something else I want to touch on for just a minute. I had to stop and think about what it was because I was kind of keeping track of the stuff in my mind. He mentions Gallic. And a lot of Americans, myself included, until a few years ago, we see that word G-A-E-L-I-C, and a lot of us pronounce it Gaelic. Well, Gaelic is the Irish form. A lot of people just sometimes call it Irish. In Ireland, the language is Gaelic. In Scotland, it's Gallic. It's spelled exactly the same, and it's a lot of similarities, but they will correct you in Scotland if you say Gaelic when you mean Gallic.
But the 4th Regiment's muskets are already loaded. Officers give the command, and soldiers blast a splintering volley of lead and smoke. The battle for Culloden is underway.
So just for some context here, 1746, we're talking about just a couple of years, I mean a decade or so before the beginning of the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War here in North America, which really in many ways some people will call World War Zero because it does really kind of become a world war. We are just a couple of decades away from the American Revolution, and we're just a century, less than a century after the English Civil War. So England has been undergoing periods of, I shouldn't say England, at this point it's Great Britain, it'll be the United Kingdom in another half century. Great Britain has been undergoing a lot of conflict for centuries, a lot of it internal, and this is one of the last deeply internal conflicts that's going to happen in the British Isles. In fact, I would say, I know I'm talking a lot here, Culloden's the last pitched battle ever fought in Great Britain between two armies on land.
This episode is brought to you by, well, you, our lovely patrons over at Patreon. To hear about how you can vote on history topics we make shows about, and some pretty neat new stuff in the EC merch store, please stay tuned until after the episode. 2 hours earlier, with the wind and sleet whistling across the moor, the two armies stood facing each other. They were within cannon range, but for the time being, nobody fired.
And so notice it says Jacobite and government. It doesn't say like Scotland and England, because that's not what this is. This is the Jacobites versus the government. I'm sure he's going to explain those things. But it really is a rebellion by people who on both sides feel like they are supporting the rightful king of Scotland and England.
Commanding one side was Charles Edward Stuart, Prince of the deposed Jacobite line. Handsome, with an Italian accent, courtesy of his birthplace in Rome.
And he's actually buried at the Vatican. We saw his grave when we were there in Italy back in April. They call him Bonnie Prince Charlie. And he's not the heir to, I mean, he is the heir to the throne. He's not the claimant to the throne at this moment. Sometimes people mistake that. His father's still very much alive at this point.
The Bonnie Prince had spent his life yearning to reclaim the throne taken from his grandfather, James Stuart, in 1688. That year, Protestant subjects in both Scotland and England, dissatisfied with James's Roman Catholicism and disregard for Parliament, had deposed him and invited his son-in-law, the Prince of Orange, to take the throne in.
Kinda. It's more than just that. We call this the Glorious Revolution. This is in the aftermath. We're talking a couple of decades after the English Civil War. And people were unhappy, and the English had really pushed strongly, and so had Scotland, away from Roman Catholicism, starting with Henry VIII a century earlier. And so the replacing of what they saw as a Catholic influenced by the Pope and by other Catholic nations made sense. But it wasn't just William of Orange. It was also his wife, Mary, who is Queen Mary II, who they are invited to jointly rule. This is like a rare time in history that this happens, where you have joint monarchs, and they both have claims to the throne in their own right. And so it's not just his son-in-law, it's also his daughter that are going to jointly reign at this point. That's why we have, like in Virginia, you have the College of William and Mary. It's named after these two monarchs. It's called the Glorious Revolution because people say, oh, well, you know, it happened without firing a shot. There was no bloodshed. Well, yeah, there was. It just didn't happen at the time. It happened in the next 80 or 60 years after that. There was a lot of bloodshed because of this.
In his stead, James then went into exile as the new dynasty took control. Yet in 1745, at the age of 25, Bonnie Prince Charlie almost reclaimed the throne his grandfather lost. Landing in the Scottish Highlands, he convinced a number of clans to join him in a march on London.
So you got to think, he's landing in the Highlands. These guys are pretty suspect anyway. This guy grew up in Italy. He's not native to the country. And so when he first lands, they tell him to go home. And by that, they mean go back to Italy. And he very dramatically looks around and says, I am home. And, you know, the Stuarts had been originally the kings of Scotland. Had been kings of Scotland for centuries at this point. And James IV, James Stuart, marries the sister of Henry VIII, the daughter of King Henry VII. And so when Henry VIII's brother dies, and then his own three children succeed to the throne, but he never has any legitimate grandchildren. Once Queen Elizabeth I dies, the throne then passes to the next member of the Tudor dynasty, which is a Stuart. It happens to be the great-grandson of Henry VIII's sister, who had married James IV. They had their son James V. James V had a daughter, Mary Queen of Scots, and then Mary Queen of Scots' son becomes James VI of Scotland. And so at that point, the Stuart dynasty of Scotland becomes the Stuart dynasty of England and Scotland. So it's through the Stuart line that the claims to the throne are going to exist, and they're going to be Jacobite because Jacob is just a Latinized form of James. And they are, in terms of next in line to the throne, the Jacobite line is senior. And the current heir to the Jacobite throne is actually the guy who would also be the heir to Bavaria. I think he's the Duke of Bavaria. We actually visited his house when I was in Munich.
And the rebel Jacobite army made it all the way through northern England before being forced to turn back.
That's another great point. This army actually was super successful. They go all the way down into a good bit into, I think, around Durham or something. They go pretty far down into England. But they decide they can't hold it because they know a massive army's coming, so they fall back. And when they meet at Culloden against the king's brother's forces, or is it the king's son at this point, I guess? He's the brother of a future king. Who are we dealing with? We're dealing with George II on the throne at this point. The numbers are pretty even between the two armies.
Now they returned to the Highlands to make their decisive stand. Now, while Charles's rebel army consisted mostly of Highland clansmen, this was no battle between England and Scotland, but rather a bitter civil war. The Jacobites supported Charles because his royal line were from fellow Roman Catholics, and because they saw him as their rightful monarch. Some Highlanders fought out of loyalty to their clan chiefs, while others did so because they were ordered to and risked having their homes burned if they refused the call.
At this point, we're into the middle of the 1700s. The Hanover dynasty is on the throne. And that begins with Georg I, George I, who doesn't speak a word of English, which is why we end up with a prime minister in Robert Walpole, who kind of runs the government for this English king who can't speak English. And he actually is buried in Hanover. Then George II is the king at this point. His first language is German, though he does also speak English. And then in another 14, 15 years after this, George II's grandson, George III, is going to inherit the throne. He's going to be the first English-born king of the Hanover dynasty. But there are dozens of people who are ahead of George II in line to the throne at this point. But because of being Catholic, they're all barred by the Act of Settlement that says, and to this day, because they're also head of the Church of England, you can't be a Catholic and be the monarch.
But in addition, the Jacobite forces also included lowland Scots, whose culture differed from the Highlanders, as well as Englishmen and Irishmen. In fact, there were even French regiments, since France was rooting for a Stuart victory. Opposing them, 500 meters across the moor, was the British army, led by the corpulent Duke of Cumberland, the third son of the British King George II, and a distant cousin of Charles.
Yeah, so Duke of Cumberland's like around 24, 25 years old at this point, and shortly before the Battle of Culloden, he gives an order that there will be no quarter, which is why the casualties in this battle are going to be so ridiculously one-sided, because most of the men who die on the Jacobite side are going to be killed after surrendering, killed after being wounded, just kind of wiped out on the battlefield. It's a deeply sad place to visit because you see these mass graves of all the different clans, and a lot of that has to do with the ruthlessness of the Duke of Cumberland.
Cumberland had swore to crush the rebellion, thereby securing the crown for his family line. And the British army under his command included a mixture of English and Scottish regiments, since the 1707 Act of Union had joined the two countries. These included the Royal Scots Regiment, the oldest in the British Army, and the Royal Scots Fusiliers. But it wasn't only lowland Scottish regiments wearing red that day. Many Highland clans had chosen to back the British government against the Jacobites, with the Campbells among the most famous to have taken up arms against Charles.
I descend from MacDonald's, so MacDonald clan were on the Jacobite side during all of this. And there's a very famous incident in a place called Glencoe, which is one of the most beautiful places on the planet. It's called the Massacre at Glencoe. And it wasn't just the Campbells, but the Campbells kind of take the rap for this, who come in and slaughter the McDonalds. And among my family was my sixth great-grandfather, who was a McDonald, who fled after all of this and actually changed their name to Smith when they came to America. So to this day, you go to Glencoe and you'll see signs some places that say no Campbells. Like if your last name's Campbell, they won't let you stay there. They won't let you eat there if they see it on your credit card.
The Bonnie Prince had arranged his army in 2 lines, with the Highland clans in the front, and this was with good reason. For the Highland charge, with its claymore broadswords, had caused the Redcoats to flee in almost every battle of the rebellion.
And red and blue are very iconic with this. If you go to the battlefield today, you see red and blue flags marking the battle lines. It's really cool because they have these flag posts that show exactly where the units were. You've got signs that show here's where this clan was with 200 men, and here's where this regiment was with 150 men. And it's very, very easy to visualize these battle lines because they were just 2 long lines facing off each other, and the ground there is horrible. It's swampy, it's marshy, it's sometimes several feet of water. It is not the place to fight a battle.
Nevertheless, there was still grumbling among the ranks. See, the previous night, Charles had bungled a surprise attack, and his troops wandered into the dark, never finding the enemy. As a result, the Jacobites were now cold, hungry, and exhausted. Furthermore, the clans, steeped in pride and tradition, had quarreled over who should get the most prestigious spot in the battle line. Meanwhile, across the field, the British formed 3 lines, each consisting of a row of regiments with artillery. Cumberland placed his cavalry on the flanks and deployed his loyal Highlanders on the left behind a walled enclosure.
So this is a great example of where numbers are so much less important than tactics, cohesion, organization, because the numbers on the battlefield are fairly even, but the government side has better weapons, better tactics, ends up with better ground because they're holding their ground while the enemy is attacking through difficult terrain, and it turns into a very one-sided bloodbath.
Then, around 1 p.m., Jacobite cannons opened fire, and the government artillery responded, with the experienced British Royal Artillery crews quickly gaining the upper hand.
So I've been reading about this, and if you look at some of the Jacobite sources, they will describe that this went on for as long as a half hour. Other sources say it was only 5 or 10 minutes of artillery dueling going on. It's probably closer to the latter. And this has an effect. Not so much. I mean, these are small weapons. These are like 3-pound and 6-pound field guns. In many cases, really small. You got a few mortars too, but it has a psychological effect on the Jacobite army, and in some ways, it kind of forces them to move.
For 15 minutes, cannonballs pummeled the Jacobites, scything off arms, legs, and heads, and mortars lobbed explosive shells into their ranks. Seeing no other option, Charles ordered the advance. The call of "Claymore! Claymore!" ran up and down the line, and the men began to move forward. But the boggy moorland was ill-suited to a sudden rush.
That's 100% accurate. When you see my video from the site, horrible place to fight a battle. And some parts were better than others, which meant that some parts of the line advanced faster than others. And they have a really cool, when you go there, you actually can watch this computer laid out screen, and it actually has individuals, little dots for all the soldiers, and it shows how their cohesion breaks up and how the right side of the Jacobite line advances much quicker than the left side, and how that impacts the battle.
And the Jacobites struggled through the unstable ground. The left flank failed to even reach the government lines, while the center veered to the right, where the soil was firmer. Thus, the center and right of the Jacobite formation entangled into one disorganized mass, bearing down on the government's left flank. The 2 government regiments, totaling around 900 men, suddenly found themselves facing a rebel horde 2,500 strong. The Jacobites then paused their advance briefly to fire their muskets and pistols at the Redcoats, and those armed with broadswords drew them, while others fixed bayonets.
And remember what I said a few minutes ago, organization, cohesion, it matters. They're outnumbered better than 2 to 1 on the left flank of the government line, but their organization, their cohesion, their ability to counterattack, their favorable ground. It all makes a difference here.
Then they charged, appearing to the British 4th Regiment out of the haze of the battlefield. The 4th Regiment fired only a single volley, whereas the regiment next to it managed two, bullets ripping into the charging Scots. For a moment, the smoke hides the carnage. Officers bark to level their bayonets rather than reload. The front rank stands, presenting a wall of bristling steel, just as the Jacobites surge into view, leaping over the bodies of their kinsmen.
And remember, while all this is going on, it's sleet falling. It's awful, awful weather. They're tired. Many of these men haven't had a lot of sleep. It's ugly.
Then, contact. The Jacobites crash into the red-coated ranks. Swords hack and bayonets stab. A Scottish captain runs a charging Jacobite through in his pike before he's cleaved in half by a poleaxe. And near that chaos, the regiment's colonel has his hand chopped off by a claymore. In this frenzy, the British regiment is overrun. Its flags waver and fall, their standard bearer is killed. Previously, the Highland charge has always caused the redcoats to run. But this time, something different happens. This time, the British hold firm, but they cannot stem the tide. Rather than run, they instead die where they stand. And despite the musketry and cannon fire, the treacherous ground, and the stubborn British resistance, Jacobites rush through the gap they've carved. This breakthrough is short-lived, however. For instead of open ground, the Jacobites meet a second line of government infantry. 4 fresh regiments move up to corral them, and the rebels have nowhere to go. The British regulars, trained to fire 1 round every 20 seconds, pound methodical volleys into the disorganized clansmen. In just 5 minutes, the regiments unleashed thousands of bullets into the Jacobite charge. Meanwhile, Highlanders loyal to the British government also outflanked the Jacobites via a stone wall and add to the crossfire their bagpipes shrieking.
So there's a stone wall, and they knock down part of the wall so that they can go through this area, and you can still see a recreated version of that wall on the right side. And everything at this point is becoming chaos on the Jacobite side. There's no cohesion. There's no organization. The left side hasn't even gotten to reach the front lines at this point. It's turning into a slaughter.
Last hopes for a Stuart restoration are cut down amidst a volley of lead, crashing with the regularity of ocean waves. The Jacobites broke, and Cumberland unleashed his dragoons in pursuit. All across the field, the British advanced to secure their victory, with one British private, a survivor from the overrun 4th, recalling how every bayonet in his regiment was bloody and bent. In the aftermath, government soldiers killed Jacobite prisoners, as well as civilians caught up in the retreat in cold blood. And many who conducted these battlefield executions were fellow Scots, enacting revenge for old grudges.
Yeah, and there are remnants of that to this day. I visited Fort George, which is this massive fort that was built in Inverness, or near Inverness. It's actually real close to the Culloden battlefield, as a point of strength in order to be able to keep the Highlands pacified in the years after this. The Black Watch is a unit that is a loyal to the government unit that helps kind of pacify the North, and so there's still a lot of bad blood toward the Black Watch because of that, and they're stationed there at Fort George for a few more years anyway. So a lot of the remnants of this are still felt in some ways to this day. They're gonna, he may talk about this, they're gonna ban the playing of bagpipes, the speaking of Gaelic. They're gonna eliminate the clans. It's ugly. It's basically cultural genocide after this battle.
Though Charles Stuart himself fled before the battle's end, escaping the field, he was smuggled across the Highlands and slipped
dressed
back
as
to
a woman.
mainland Europe. He spent the rest of his life there in exile, descending into alcoholism and depression. And in addition to those killed on the day of the battle, over 100 Jacobites were executed in the weeks after Culloden, and around 1,000 were transported to the colonies. Troops burned captured Jacobite flags before a cheering crowd in Edinburgh. The battle marking a major turning point for both Scotland and Britain as a whole. After Culloden, Parliament passed laws that banned bearing arms and traditional Highland dress. And while many of these were repealed in the following decades, they did hasten to the end of Highland clan culture, a fact that a number of lowland Scots welcomed.
So, and understand that geologically speaking, the Appalachian Mountains of the eastern United States are the same mountain range as the Highlands of Scotland. They were all once the same. And the culture that in large part was eliminated in the aftermath of Culloden in Scotland, a lot of that got transferred to the southeastern part of the United States, places like North and South Carolina and Virginia, and then eventually eastern Kentucky and Tennessee. And a lot of that clan identity gets transferred into the feuds that you see between families in places like Kentucky. A lot of that anti-government sentiment exists to this day in people who believe in strong states' rights government, particularly strong in the American South. That's all inherited from the Scottish Highlands.
But since the government's Highland regiments were still allowed to wear tartan and carry traditional weapons, Highland men then joined in droves as one of the only means of continuing their traditions. And with the threat of a Stuart restoration removed, a century of British Civil War finally ended. With its homeland now secure and the government able to look outwards, it was now set to emerge as a dominant global power. But Scotland never forgot the Stuarts and the Bonnie Prince. By the early 1800s, with the threat of Stuart restoration long removed, Scotland, which had mostly rejected the Jacobites, began to romanticize Charles and his rebellion. Culloden became the subject of nostalgic songs, poems, and even cookie advertisements, and remembrances of it encouraged the reintroduction of the tartan and the development of clan patterns, now a staple of Scottish identity.
Yeah, people don't realize that's a very modern thing, the tartans identified with different clans. That is not something that goes back 300, 400, 500 years for the most part. It's in a lot of ways, it's embraced because of the tourism aspect of it, and I think probably a lot of Americans are more into it than people in Scotland are. Not that they all are that way, but also it's important to note that in the aftermath of this, I've alluded to it already, there's something called the Highland Clearances, which is very much kind of, again, a cultural genocide, but also literally a clearing of the land. So in the aftermath of Culloden, a lot of this land is taken from these clans, and it's given to, and these clans operated a lot like mobs with mob bosses. A lot of the land is given to Englishmen, it's given to aristocrats, and what they figure out is that it's much more cost-effective to have sheep on your land than it is to have tenants who are renting farms, subsistence farms. And so they jack up the prices on the rent on the land to where people can't afford it, and they have to either leave and go to America or Australia or Canada or somewhere else, or they just have to go down to the south somewhere. And all the land gets cleared, and that's why there's so many sheep there to this day. The Highland Clearances was a form of driving people out of the Highlands, and the population has never recovered to this day.
A bloody day that both ended a dynasty and defined a nation. You know, one of the main reasons we're able to make extra...
So, yeah, that was really good stuff. And obviously, I'm deeply connected to my own personal Scottish heritage, and a lot of my heritage exists because of these events. And I'm guessing if you're American, Canadian, a lot of other countries, or Scottish, you probably also have connections to this. But it's a fascinating story. It's a very tragic story. And hopefully you've gotten a little bit more insight into the reality behind things like the TV show Outlander. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.